and being the largest really in over a generation. So looking ahead, we'd say it's had a number of effects. First is on demand. The next slide. We've seen a lot of development that has, could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. A lot of development is in trouble. And you've had situations where this is a building, an office building, that just was stopped. The construction activity was just stopped. We've seen condominiums stopped. We've seen retail stopped. We've seen a lot of things go back to banks. And then there's a lot of things have been locked in. Publicly traded companies that are real estate REITs have been marked to market, and so they've had an adjustment. But a lot of privately held real estate has not been marked to market, and it's kind of in a limbo. But one of the primary problems is the return of demand. I think Houston's in a little bit better shape than other parts of the country, but in some parts of the country it's really very difficult to predict when will demand return in a sufficient volume to move the product that was built that hasn't been occupied or hasn't even been completed. So I think the fundamentals, real estate fundamentals, are going to vary market by market. But that's going to have an impact on, well, not only on the suburbs and suburbia in the future, but I think it'll have an impact on every part of the country. Next slide is the capital stack. You've seen, I think, going forward, more equity is going to be required. I mean, lenders are beginning to open the door again and say they're interested in making new loans, but the debt-to-equity ratios are different, and that's going to have an impact on who can develop and where they can develop. It'll be a different metric for what kind of returns people achieve in the development process, and I think that'll have an impact on how the suburbs develop. Third, and perhaps maybe the most important in the long run, next slide, is going to be the consumer. And I think the consumer has definitely changed. One thing that's happened is the consumer now knows about risk. And for a very long period of time, people just didn't really count risk in making their decisions. And you could see that in so many examples in the way that the mortgage crisis developed, the kinds of decisions people were making about purchasing houses and the kinds of mortgages they were putting in place. That has changed. And so now I think instead of the notion, which I think you could read Wall Street Journal and a lot of economic press that argued that because of the skill of the way we were running the economy, we had really conquered the economic cycle. And if you look back, there were people who were saying this as recently as 5 years ago. So that we could expect that the big swings in downturns that we experienced historically, we were released from that going forward. I think now that certainty has been replaced with uncertainty. And the element of risk is just a calculation. It's something that they're thinking, customers are thinking about their purchasing decisions twice. Doesn't mean they're not making purchasing decisions, but they're not making them with the same carefree attitude they were years ago. Also, we're seeing people who are looking at, they don't want to spend money in a wasteful way. They don't want to buy more than they need. Now again, they still are not going for frugality. People still they aspire for a better quality of life. People are still looking for, to enhance the way they're living, but now they have to prioritize. Now they have to weigh what risks are they taking on by buying this house, or what risks are they taking on by making this purchase, and are those risks justified? So the value system, I don't think it's simply frugality. I think people are still willing to pay for value, but they're not doing it without second thoughts, and they're not doing it without prioritization. Next slide. Another trend. So the first trend I said is recovering from the recession, and I think those three slides, we have got demand has to improve, the capital stack has to be understood better, and there's to be stability, and the customer's mindset, people have to really recalibrate to how people are making decisions today. On the positive side, the United States is poised for, and most people are projecting, a pretty robust period of growth in a secular sense. So we have a cyclical downturn right now, but in a secular sense, our population is still projected to grow. And in fact, over the next 30 years, grow by 100 million. And a few of you have talked about, there's a book that came out a few weeks ago called The Next 100 Million Americans, which lays out some of these arguments in more detail. They're coming from census forecasts and other reports. And one of the things that's interesting is most of the growth will occur in these mega regions, and most of that growth actually further will be in the southern mega regions. And Houston and Texas generally is very well positioned for both. But one of the aspects of this, when you look at the census forecast and you study it, they're projecting that the white employment, or white population growth, will actually continue to grow, but slower than Hispanic, slower than Asian. So Asian and Hispanic are both more than doubling in the next 30 years by most census forecasts. Whereas white population continues to grow at a slower pace, and then actually right around the 2040, they're showing it actually beginning to decline a little bit. So it's a lower growth rate. This turns into, when you project it out, a situation where America is no longer a white minority, pardon me, majority, but it actually would be a white minority. Now, this has been a concern in the United States for a very long time. Benjamin Franklin, actually, if some of you have studied or read his work, he was very concerned about non-white immigrants taking over Pennsylvania and the colonies. And he wrote profusely about the threat of the Germans. They were the non-whites he was worried about. But the Germans would take over Pennsylvania. They were swarthy and they were not really able, they have the same complexion as the Anglos who had settled Pennsylvania. And they would Germanize the United States rather than really becoming absorbed. We would all be speaking German. I don't think that's really a fear, today even. If you look at, some of you may know, third-generation Mexican Americans, don't expect them to know Spanish. For the most part, they know as much Spanish as your children would know going to grade school. But they don't, the assimilation, the force of assimilation, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a generation or two. But the force of assimilation has tended to bring people in, and the melting doesn't happen overnight, but it tends to happen. Next slide. So this is the population forecast is not only that it will be growing, and again, the 100 million in 30 years, but it's growing not just in number, but it's growing in heterogeneity. Even today, about $1 in $4 of consumer spending is from Hispanics, blacks, Native Americans, and Asians, and that's expected to grow. And this has an impact on the suburbs because whereas maybe in the 19th century and the early 20th century, immigrants were people who migrated to the country and moved into the center cities, and they created the Chinatowns, the Little Italies, that we've all seen in movies. The new immigrants to the United States are really going all over the place, and they're as much in the suburbs as they are in the center city. In fact, more likely to be in the suburbs than in the center city. So this is going to have an impact on suburbia, and again, just as the last population, the population increase from 1945 till today has primarily benefited the suburbs and has populated the suburbs, I think this next 100 million will also be predominantly focused on the suburban development. Next slide. Next is the digital transformation. And I mean, this is one that I'm just picking a few slides, but I mean, this could be a talk in itself. I worked on a project called Columbia Town Center in Columbia, Maryland, which is in Howard County. Unlike Houston, a very, very strict regulatory environment. Zoning takes years easily, in some cases has taken a decade. But when we sought out to rezone Columbia, Maryland's town center, we found that a huge amount of what was going on was not happening in the public meetings at night or not happening at the Planning Commission. It was happening electronically on this blog of Columbia 2.0. And at every public meeting, you'd have a public meeting at night. By the time you woke up the next morning, there would be critiques on that meeting by Columbia 2.0. And what happened was, fortunately for us, they really liked what we were proposing. So they were able to be a voice that, frankly, I'd never seen in any rezoning I'd worked on before. But that's one instance where the community, and when you're in the Woodlands or Bridgeland or the other master plan communities, you're creating not just real estate, but you are creating a social and civic community. The Columbia community expressed itself in a way that I'd never seen people express themselves. Moving back here, the next slide. I'm sure if you're doing any real estate development, residential, you're on Facebook. Facebook today, 8% of all internet activity is people on Facebook right now, which is absolutely amazing. 500 million people are members of Facebook. Now, Bridgeland is on Facebook, and 440 people like this. They actually have more members that have signed up, but the ones who have said they actually like it are 446. What's really interesting about this is that 150 million people are on Facebook on their cell phones or on their smartphones. And we're going to see that is becoming more and more important. The next slide. Digital transformations, while it's having an impact on how residential real estate is sold, it's having a tremendous impact on retail. A tremendous impact on retail. And you can see the compound rate of growth for online merchants is nearly 20%, substantially higher than chain merchant sales. And that's continuing. The next slide. This is looking at on the left, just what's happened, and I don't know every Blockbuster, but I know the ones that are in areas that I've followed, a lot of them are closing. And even though they are trying to move more to the Netflix model, this is a quote from one of the financial press, Netflix has Blockbuster on the ropes. The slide on the right, or the image on the right, is showing you that in 2006, Amazon overshot Borders, and then about a year later, 2007, 2008, overshot Barnes & Noble. And that looks like that's just continuing. And if you think about the implications for bricks and mortar retail, you've seen Tower Records disappear. You've seen other merchants in that process of in decline. And who can survive that shift will be an important dimension. One of the things that's happening, though, and the next slide will show you,